CSS or cascading style sheet is an important yet often underrated programming language. With techniques like media queries, flexbox, and grid layout, it's a powerful tool capable of providing a visual treat for its users. Now, despite it being an underappreciated language in the web development field, CSS still managed to snag a position in the top 5 in Stack Overflow's developer survey. In fact, according to Indeed, web developers who know CSS are in high demand for business. And it's not just about these article references. If you were to go to Google right now and search for CSS developer jobs, you'd end up with more than 3,000 job opportunities for HTML and CSS developers. Now that we've established the demand for CSS, let's talk about another key aspect: salaries. An average CSS developer earns a salary of around 4 lakhs per year, according to Glassdoor. However, keep in mind that these are for the CSS developers who have some kind of prior knowledge working in the web development field. Now that all these aspects are considered, let's get into the reason why you clicked on this video. The video contains a set of 30 carefully compiled questions in the form of increasing complexity. These questions have been put together after careful analysis and consultation by the industry experts associated with us. And they have been split into 10 and packed into 3 different modules: easy, medium, and hard. So without any further ado, let's get right into the video. So let's start with our very first question. That is, what is the CSS box model and what are its components? The CSS box model is a fundamental concept in web design that describes how different components of a web elements are structured and positioned on a web page. The CSS box model is split into 4 components, starting with the innermost part where the content is enclosed. The size of this content area can be controlled using properties like width and height. Next, we have padding, which is the space between the content and the border. Padding can be customized on all sides using properties like padding, padding top, right, bottom, and left. On number 3, we have border. The border wraps around padding and content. It acts as the edge of the element, which specifies the thickness, style, and color. Border's appearance can be controlled using properties like border, border width, border style, and border color. Lastly, we have the margin, which is the outermost part of the box model. The margin creates a space between the element and its neighboring elements. Margin can be defined using properties like margin, margin top, right, bottom, and left. Now, based on your answer, the interviewer might dissect this question further to check your understanding of the various components. Which brings us to our next question, which is, what is the difference between margin and padding in the CSS box model? Padding is the space inside the border of an element, which creates space between the contents of the box and the border of the box. Margin, on the other hand, creates space between the element and its neighboring elements. Apart from this, margins are always transparent and do not inherit the background color or styles of the elements. Padding, on the other hand, inherits the background color and styles of the element, as it is part of the element's visual area. Now that we have demolished the box model, let's move on to our next question. What's the difference between visibility hidden and display none? Now, although these two might look the same to the human eye, behind the scenes, they work quite differently. The visibility hidden hides the element from the screen, but the element still exists. It's more like making the object transparent, but the object does not disappear from the web page. But in the case of display none, not only does the object become invisible, but it disappears completely from the screen, and the other elements shift to fill the gap. So in a nutshell, use visibility hidden when you want to hide some content without breaking the layout, or if you want to toggle visibility by adding some animation or transition later down the line. Display none should be used when you want to remove an element completely from both the view and the entire layout. After this question, you would have got a gist of how important layouts can be in CSS. So it should come as no surprise to you that positioning styles exist within CSS to decide the position of an element within a web page. Let's explore these in detail with our next question. How do the 4 CSS positioning values, absolute, relative, fixed, sticky, affect the layout? So the 4 positioning values, absolute, relative, fixed, and sticky, are used to determine the position of an element in a web page, which must be clear to you at this point. However, every position is always relative to some other element, or in simpler words, the positioning of the child element, be it absolute, relative, fixed, or sticky, will always be dependent on a parent element. Now let's look at them one by one. Starting with absolute. Absolute is like the extreme case when it comes to positioning elements. An element with position absolute does not care about the other elements it exists with. It always positions itself relative to its nearest ancestor. And if no such ancestor exists, then it positions itself to the root HTML element. Next, we have relative. An element with position relative is always positioned according to its original position. For example, in this code, the top 50 pixel and the left 50 pixel are relative to its original position. Next, we have fixed. An element with position fixed is relative to the viewport, meaning it stays in the same place even when the page is scrolled. Viewport means the visible part of the browser window. Lastly, we have sticky. An element with position sticky behaves like relative until a defined scroll mark is reached, after which it sticks to its defined scroll mark for the entire web page. So in a nutshell, absolute can be used for drop-down menus or pop-up modules. Relative can be used for fine-tuning images. Fixed is used for navigation bars or back to the top buttons. And sticky can be used for progress indicators or even sidebar navigation. Moving on to our next question, explain how Flexbox layout work and why they are useful. Flexbox or flexible box layout is a layout model designed to provide equal distribution and sizing to all the elements within a container, even when the size of the container changes. This becomes especially useful when the sizes are dynamic or unknown, making it a smart choice for a responsive layout. Using Flexbox will result in your content being both horizontally and vertically aligned within the container. Along with Flexbox, another very commonly used layout is the grid layout, which brings us to our next question. Describe the CSS grid layout and its role in creating complex layouts. The drawback of using Flexbox is that it works in one dimension, which is either a row or a column. Now, grid allows you to work with both row and column simultaneously. Grid can define a grid structure of rows and columns in which the direct children are placed, like this 1 to 6 divs, which are placed neatly into their defined spaces inside the grid container. We'll be looking into the differences between grid and Flexbox in the later parts of this video, so make sure to stick to the end to get the most out of this video. Moving forward to our 7th question, what are the CSS combinators and how do they define the relationships between selectors? In CSS, combinators are special keywords or symbols that define the relationship between two or more elements. These are used to select elements based on their position or relationship in the DOM hierarchy. There are mainly 4 types of combinators in CSS: the descendant, child, adjacent sibling, and general sibling combinator. Let's start with the descendant combinator. As the name suggests, this one targets all the elements that are the direct descendants of a specific parent element, like these child paragraph elements, which are the descendants of this parent div tag. To select these paragraph elements within the div tag, you can use the descendant combinator like this. Next, we have the child combinator. This one targets all the elements that are the direct children of a specified parent element, like how this paragraph tag inside the div tag with ID box is getting affected, but the other paragraph which is inside another div is not getting affected. To select the paragraph tag appearing right after the div tag, you can use the child combinator like this. Followed by child combinator, we have the adjacent sibling combinator, which targets an element that is immediately preceded by another specific element, like this paragraph tag, which is the next in line for the div tag. Keep in mind that it should be the sibling and not the child. To select the first sibling paragraph tag appearing right after the div tag, you can use the adjacent sibling combinator like this. Lastly, we have the general sibling combinator, which targets all the elements that are siblings of a specified element and come after it, like all these paragraph tags after the div tag. To select all the sibling paragraph tags appearing right after the div tag, you can use the general sibling combinator like this. Now that you have seen the combinators in action, let's move on to our next question, which is, what is the difference between inline styles and external style sheet? And when should you use each? Inline styles are written directly inside an HTML element. It's used for quick styling where reusability isn't needed. Inline styling should be avoided for large projects or repeated styles. External styles, on the other hand, are defined in a separate CSS file and are linked to the HTML file. An external style sheet is used in large projects with consistent, reusable styles across multiple pages. Avoid using external style sheet to apply styles to individual elements. Moving on to our next question, which is, What does the mobile-first design mean, and how does it relate to the responsive CSS? Now, the mobile-first design, as the name suggests, is an approach that prioritizes development on the mobile devices first before scaling up to larger screens, like tabs or desktops. The vision behind this approach is to start with the smaller screen size and add complexity and modification as the screen size increases. Moving on to our next question. What do you understand by the CSS pseudo-classes? Pseudo-classes are primarily created in CSS to respond to user interactions, element states, or their position in the DOM hierarchy. You must have used the hover functionality of CSS while working with buttons. This is one example of the user interaction pseudo-class. To start with, we have the user interaction, which is applied to links, buttons, and inputs. User interaction consists of hover, which we saw earlier. Next, we have focus, which styles an element when it is focused, like this input tag inside a form element in this particular example. Lastly, we have the active tag, which applies style when an element is being clicked, like this anchor tag which turns red while being clicked. After user interaction, we have structural or positional pseudo-classes, which are mainly applied to list items and table rows. You can see here how the first child and the last child are only affecting the first and the last list elements inside the UL tag. As for the nth child, it is applied on this table, which turned the odd rows of this table into a plum color and the even rows into a light green color. Following structural/positional, we have dynamic state, which is split into checked and disabled. Checked applies styles to checked input elements, like both these checked and unchecked input boxes inside the form tag, and disabled, which disables form elements, like this disabled button inside the form tag. Lastly, we have the other examples, in which we have the not selector, which is used to dim inactive elements, like this inactive div tag. The empty selector is used to hide the elements which doesn't have any content in them, like this empty div tag, which is hidden using the display none property. And with that, we reach the end of this module. Now let's move on to our next module.
Now let's move on to our next module, that is the medium module, and let's start with our first question, or rather our 11th question, which is, how does specificity work in CSS and how is it calculated? Now, to understand what exactly specificity is, consider this one example. Now, say there's this family having an important discussion about some financial matters. Now, whose opinion do you think is much more likely to be heard in this particular family? Obviously, it will either be the mother or the father, as they are the head of the family. So that is how specificity also works in CSS. So that is in CSS, certain selectors have a higher priority above other selectors. Let's look at the definition. CSS specificity is a measure of how specific a selector is in targeting an HTML element. It is calculated based on the type of selectors used. Now, there are different types of selectors in CSS, like the inline styles, the IDs, the classes, attributes, and pseudo-classes, and then elements and pseudo-elements. Now, out of all of these, naturally, inline styles, or the inline CSS that you must have heard of, has the highest priority with 1000, then followed by ID, which has a priority of 100. Then we have classes, attributes, and pseudo-class, which has a priority of 10. Lastly, we have elements and pseudo-elements, which has a priority of 1. So if I were to look at it with the help of a code, let me open my VS Code over here. This is specificity. Okay. So if I have a paragraph here, hey, this is a para, and if I give this, say, a class of para class, oh, I didn't add the style, and I'm giving it the color, say red, naturally it will be red. But the moment I add an ID here, say para ID, and then I give another color, say green, it changes from red to green because IDs have a higher priority over classes. And now, even if I take this even further and add a color here, say blue violet, now it will become blue violet because inline styles have a higher priority over ID and over classes. Now, I hope that was enough to clear it. Let's move on to the next question. Okay, which is, how do block, inline, and inline block elements differ in layouts? So layouts in CSS are very important. We discussed this in the previous module as well. So now there are 3 specific main primary layouts in CSS, which is the block, inline, and inline block. So the first one is block. Now block is like, say this is a stadium and there's this one guy sitting here. Now block is like this one guy who takes up the whole row in which they are sitting. So that is like how block works. Then inline block. Inline block is they only take the space that they need. They don't take the whole row. Only the space to contain their elements. Say there's a box and there are some elements inside of it, some content inside of it. So depending on the content's size, the box's size changes. So that's how these people are. They're only taking the space that they need. Next you have inline block. Now inline block is like they do have a specific area reserved. It's not like, it doesn't really depend on the content. You can decide the size of the box, but still it will not take the whole row. It will only take the size that it needs. That is, look at how these people, they're taking a certain amount of space and it's obviously bigger than their content, but they're taking a little bit of space. They're taking a little bit of extra space, but that doesn't mean they're taking the whole space like the block elements. And these three is how block, inline and inline blocks work. So if you were to look at the technical definition, block takes up the full width of their parent container by default, and they begin on the next line. That is, if you define one block and the next block. So this first block will take the whole line, second block will take the next whole line. Inline take up only as much width as is necessary based on their content and do not cause a line break and flow horizontally. Inline block can behave both like an inline and block elements in terms of layout properties such as padding, margin and borders. In case of inline block, you can specify the margin and padding and everything. Based on that, it will take as much space as it requires, but there will be a fixed space. It's not as flexible as inline. Let's look at the code so that you can have a better understanding. CSS layouts. Let me create 2 blocks and 2 inline and 2 inline block. Let's set the style for the block first. Naturally display block. For inline, next you have inline block. Okay, let's see how that looks. Okay, now look how these two are like stacked on 2 different lines and these all are like stacked all together. Inline block, inline block, inline block. Let me just add a little bit of styling so that you can see the difference clearly. Here it's display block. Let me add the width as 100%. Let's add a background color, say red. I'll give a little margin bottom so that they have a little bit of space. And then the padding as 10 pixels. For inline, let's give the background color as pale violet red. Margin right as 10 pixels. Padding 10 pixels. For this one, the background color, I need a margin right for this one too. 10 pixel. Padding pixel. Let's see how that turned out. Okay, yeah. So this is our block. You can see it's taking up the whole row. It's taking more than that actually because I specified the width too much. Let's reduce that a little. You can see how the block is taking the whole row. Inline is only taking the space it's required, and inline block because we're specifying the padding as well. That is why it's taking the space that we particularly specified. Okay, now let's move on to the next question, which is, what is CSS inheritance and which properties are typically inherited? Now, like the name suggests, inheritance is a property in which when you define a child element inside a parent element, the child element inherits some of the traits of the parent element. Now, the child element doesn't inherit every single thing from the parents. It only inherits certain things like the font size, the font family, the font color, or if I were to look at the proper definition, it is CSS inheritance is a mechanism by which some properties are passed down from the parent elements to its child elements in the DOM. Let's see how this works with the help of the code. So this is question 13, HTML, and this topic is inheritance. Say I have a div called as parent, and this is the parent. Now inside of this I have the child div. This is the child, and inside of this I have the grandchild. Okay, that's a lot of things. Now let's try to add style to all of these. Style, we first need the parent. So the parent's is color, say dark blue, or let's just put it red. I think red will be much more visible. Font family, I'll take Umbria. Font size, say 20 pixels. Background color, let's make this look very bad. Okay, anti-white is fine. Padding 20 pixels. Alright, parent is done. Let's see how that's coming out. Okay, so you can see how every single thing is getting inherited. Although I haven't applied any styles to this paragraph and this paragraph, but still it is inheriting the styles that I put for this particular div parent, and that is how inheritance work. Now I can obviously change this if I want to. Say I put your color, child's color as Rebecca purple, and then it affects the grandchild too, because this grandchild is a child of the first child. And now if I were to add a certain, if I add font weight also, that should also move to the, yeah, it's also affecting the grandchild. Let's change the font color, or let's change the font size here. Alright, I was just messing around with it. Now I believe you have a idea about how this works. Now let's move on to the next question, which is one of the most interesting yet confusing topics in CSS. Explain the concept of z-index and how it affects the stacking order. I remember when I was supposed to make websites and all, and we would use z-index, it was so frustrating at times because you would just forget which priority you give to which one, and then everything would just be, it would be a complete chaos. So z-index, if you're using, you need to use it with a lot of caution. Let me tell you why. Z-index becomes very handy when you have like multiple elements in a web page and you want to make sure, you want to arrange them, like you want to stack them on top of each other, but there should be some priority. It's like you're stacking together a bunch of photos, but you want to show, if you're stacking together a bunch of photos in say your Instagram stories, then you want to show that some photos should be on top and then some should be on bottom. So that is where z-index comes in handy for CSS as well. Say you have all these elements, these 4 elements, this yellow, pink, blue and green element in my HTML page. Now I want to make sure that all of these are stacked together, and I'm giving them different z-indexes. Yellow is z1, this pink is z4, blue is z3, and this green is z2. Now the element with the highest z-index will come on the top, and the element with the lowest z-index will go on the bottom. The higher the priority of the element will be. So right now you can see that pink has the highest z-index with z4, and yellow has the lowest z-index with z1. So if I were to stack them together, ideally z should go, z equals to 1, that is yellow, should go on the bottom, and z is equals to 4, that is pink, it should come on top. So if I stack them together, this is how they should look like. Or in a proper order, yellow followed by green, followed by blue, followed by pink. That is how the order should look like. Or in technical terms, the z-index is a CSS property that specifies the stack order of elements that overlap. Keep in mind that the higher the z-index, the higher the priority of the element. So if I were to write the code for this, this is question 14. Say I have 3 boxes, box 1, 2, 3. Now I need to apply styling for all of these. Okay, let me just enclose all of them in a container so that I don't have to apply style individually for all of them. Okay, there's my container. Okay. Position, I'm gonna give absolute so that nothing changes. Let's give the width as 300 pixel. Height as 300 pixel, margin 20 pixel, auto. That's going to centralize them. Next we have our very first box, box 1. Background color, the first one was yellow. Let's give a default width to all of them, which will be 250 pixel. Height will be 250 pixel. Position should be absolute. Top 50, left 50 so that they have a little bit of space. And the z-index is 1. Border 2 pixels solid. Okay, I should have given it here. Okay, let's see how that's looking. Alright, we haven't started the server. We have our yellow box. We need 3 more. Box 2, box 3, and box 4. So box 2 with z-index 2 is supposed to be, box 3 with z-index 3 is supposed to be not that blue, it's more like a light blue. Not this. no, this. And then the Z index with 4 is supposed to be a purple shade, but a lighter purple shade. Okay, I should not mess around with the colors because then I cannot stop. So let's see. Oh my god. Okay, I think you cannot do this. Yeah, you cannot do that. Okay. Then I'll need to specify them individually. Oh, come on. This was supposed to be relative. And you cannot do this either. Okay. So what was happening is that all these boxes are like stacked on top of each other. So we need to change their width and height so that you can actually see them. So with box 1, let's give it 300 pixels. 250 is fine for box 2. No, wait. Okay, continue. Let box 1 have 250. Box 2 will have 200. Box 3 will have 230. And box 4, let it have 200. So if you look at them, box 4 became too small. No, box 1 should be a little bit more bigger than that. This one is missing. Yeah, and let's put this as 300. Okay, that's too much. That looks very awkward. I think 250 will be fine. No, 260. Let's go with 260. Now you can see how they are stacked. Yellow with the lower Z index is at the bottom, green is on top, blue is on top, and box 4 that was pink with the highest priority is on top. That is how Z index works, and I already told you that Z index is actually a real pain in the ass. So moving on to the next question. Differentiate between CSS Grid and Flexbox. Now the difference between CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox is that CSS, when you're using CSS Grid, you specify or you reserve a place for a particular element. It's like when you go to the movie theater, you reserve a specific seat for a person, or you reserve a specific seat. So that's how CSS Grid also works. So that is if you were building a house and there's a layout for a house, you can see that everything is specified, that this much area is required for the bed, this much area is required for the bookshelf, for the sofa, for the plants, for the door, and then you put these elements on their defined space and they take up the space that you gave them. That is how CSS Grid works. But as for CSS Flexbox, it's more like pushing and pulling and adjusting according to the, you remember how inline worked, right? How they were just only taking up the space that they required. Similarly, here also you can just, when you use Flexbox, there is no specified space. They can just push and pull, or you can even adjust them. You can give the space evenly property, and then everything will be spaced evenly or space between. But the elements will just fill up the gaps and they'll just adjust and take as much as space they need. There is no reserved space for any particular element. So if you were to look at the proper definition, CSS Grid enables complicated layouts where you can design a grid and position elements at specific points on the grid. Flexbox, on the other hand, is best suited for simpler layouts that require flexibility, such as distributing space or aligning items within a container. So if you have like dynamic elements and there are a lot of elements and you don't really know how many elements are going to be added, then Flexbox is quite suitable because you can just add the space between or space evenly property and the elements will be distributed evenly without causing a lot of mess. But when it comes to grid, it is hard-coded that this much area is required, and then into that specific area, the element will be added. Now the thing is, grid will make your code look or your design look much more cleaner and neat, while Flexbox is much more chaotic. So let me show you the code just so that you can get what I'm trying to say. This is question 15. Okay. Let's do grid first. So you obviously need a grid container. Inside of this, you can have a grid item 2, 4, 5, and 6. That will be enough. Now for the grid container, obviously you need the display grid, and I'm going to divide this. I'm going to give auto. It's again going to distribute space according to how it wants. Background color, let's give crimson. There should be a padding of 10 pixels between the elements. Now as for the grid item, let's have the background color as white, border 1 pixel black. There should be padding of 20 pixels inside the elements. Font size, let's keep it 30 pixels. Text should be aligned in the center. Let's see how that came out. Okay, look at how neatly the elements are fixed. Now if you see, if I make this responsive, you can see how the contents are like only taking how the design has become responsible. This is one of the things I really love about Grid, that it takes away a lot of your work, or else you would have to have media queries and then edit every single thing. But when you use Grid, it takes away a lot of that hard work. So now let's look at Flexbox. I am going to comment it out, but you can find it in the code anyways. Okay. Next we need the Flexbox. This will be flex container, and just add a simple div tag. So for the flex container, naturally the display will be flex. Background color, again crimson. Flex containers is div. Let me just have blue violet. Margin. So I'm going to add the margin as 10 pixels and the padding is 20 pixels and font size as 30 pixels. See how that's coming? Okay. Look at how these elements are being displayed inside a huge parent container, and they are getting aligned according to, I think I can, if I put space evenly, yeah, look how they're getting distributed with equal spaces among them, and there's even space between, which means there are more spaces between the elements. That is how basically Flexbox works, but there are like a lot of dynamic elements. Like if I add another one, you can see how the elements are getting adjusted according to accommodate the new elements, and that is how a Flexbox basically works. So the space is not fixed for any element, it can keep on changing, but you can specify how the space between the elements are supposed to be to have a much more cleaner and neater version of Flexbox. So moving on to our next question. What are the key principles of CSS performance optimization? Now, obviously, optimizing the CSS performance, when running your website, its performance matters a lot. So there are certain ways, although CSS and Node.js and JavaScript as a language, that there are a lot of features and functionalities that you can use to optimize your code and leverage those particular methods that these languages provide in order to increase your browser's performance. There are certain things that you can do manually to make sure that your CSS's performance is optimized. Let's look at some of them. The first one is obviously reduce the size of your CSS file. Second one, optimize expensive properties. You must have heard of properties like box, shadow, filter. These are called as expensive properties because they are not very commonly used. So only use these properties if it's very much like important in your code, or if it's adding too much of value to your code, then only add these. Next, leverage browser caching. So whenever you load your website onto your browser, some of the elements get stored in that particular browser. So you can leverage that, you can use that to your advantage, so that every single time it's reloaded, your browser doesn't have to load everything from the scratch. Next, you have use specificity wisely, as in when specificity, we already discussed the priority of the elements. So when you're assigning priorities, if it's a style which is only to be applied to certain elements, so instead of using IDs or instead of using class selectors, you can just use inline selectors, because it's just for maybe one or two elements. So you can try using inline styles. That would save again a lot of time instead of defining a whole different ID or a whole different class. Next, you have minimize the HTTP requests. So this again comes in when you're using APIs and when you're combining the CSS with your Node.js projects and all. So when you're doing it that time, reduce the number of HTTP requests. So whatever CSS you're using, use it inside your HTML page. Try to avoid adding like 10,000 different CSS documents and then linking them all in one HTML page. That adds a lot more pressure to your code. Next, enable compression. So whenever you're transferring your CSS files, you can compress them using gzip, so that it saves a lot of space, which again optimizes your CSS's code. Next, you can use modern layout techniques. So instead of using your float, which was an older technique, you can try using CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid that we just discussed about. Next, you can avoid using deep selectors. One great example is of the Flexbox that I did right now. Here when I was selecting the grid containers, you can see how I wrote grid item for every single one. But for flex container, I didn't write anything. And when I was selecting it, I used the deep selector rule, the div which is nested inside the flex container. Now obviously this might lead you to some complications. That is, if I'm adding another parent or another element which is not supposed to be part of the flex, then it might lead to chaos. But again, it works well for the performance. So sometimes you have to do that space-time balance kind of DSA thing. You have to add it here as well. So let's move on to our next question. What is the purpose of a media query and how do they help in a responsive design? Now at this point, if you have used CSS a lot, you must already know that media query is something which helps in responsive design. Or in technical terms, a media query in CSS is a technique which is used to apply styles conditionally based on specific characteristics of the user's device or viewport, such as its width, height, resolution, orientation, and more. That is, the website that I can look at on my particular laptop will be different in somebody else's tab, or it will be different in somebody else's phone. So that website's changing its elements based on the particular device it is being viewed in is called as media query. So if I were to show you the example, if I were to show you the code, question 17.html, let me just show you how it looks, how media query is applied. Media query. Okay, say I have a paragraph here. Hey, this will change according to the size of the screen. Now, say in here I'm adding the style to the body, which is the background color I'm gonna keep as Rebecca purple, and the text color should obviously be white. But the moment the size changes, media only screen, and max width becomes 600 pixels, that is the size, I shrink the size and the size becomes 600 pixel, the body's color should become, instead of Rebecca purple, it will become pale violet red, and the text color will become black. So now if I run this code, and now if I try to create a responsive design, and if you can see it's 734, I genuinely don't know what the mistake was, but I think CSS is just acting up, and you can see how the color is changing according to the size of the screen. So if it is less than 600, you can see how the color is changing, but if it's more than 600, it remains Rebecca purple. The moment it drops from 600, moment it becomes 599, the color changes. So that is how media query works. And now let's move on to our next question. This is another very, very, very interesting and a very modern frameworks and a very popular thing that is used in a lot of modern web pages, that is keyframes. These are used to create animations and transitions, or in simpler words, these are used to create a smoother transition and animation. Let me take an example. Say you have a weather application. You must have weather applications in your mobile phones. So in the morning, that is during the sunrise, in the early morning hours, it's kind of dark outside, but still there is some sort of sunlight, like a little bit of sunlight everywhere. Not too dark, but still not too bright either. So that's when the weather application uses pale colors, because you cannot like bombard the bursting bright colors to your eyes, you will go blind. So it's pale colors to adjust with the outside temperature. Next, when it comes to the midday, throughout the whole day, the app's colors keep on changing. So in the morning, in the early morning hours, when it's not too dark, the colors are pale. But in midday, when the sun is outside and it's like really bright, so the application uses bright colors. But when it becomes darker, when the sun sets and everything becomes dark, they start using darker shades to adjust with your eyes and to experience your user experience. So how are these changing periodically? That is where your keyframes comes in. So keyframes make these transitions happen very smoothly without disrupting or breaking the whole application. So in technical terms, or in technical definition, keyframes determines how the elements' properties changes over time, and when combined with the animation property, the browser interpolates the changes, creating smoother animations and transitions. Let me show you the code. Now just bear with me. Don't think too much of this. This is a newer concept for a lot of you. So just believe in the code and keep up with me, because this is an interesting concept. Keyframe. So we're going to create a box which will be a moving box. Now naturally with transitions and animations we can do the same thing, but we're going to do this with keyframes, and I'll show you how beautiful it is. Let's first add a little bit of styling to the box. It's going to have a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels. Background color should be, let's say, peach puff. Position is relative. Animation, we're going to create an animation called as move box, which we haven't created yet, but we'll create. Ease in and out, and it keeps on looping for infinite time. Now let's create this move box. This move box is going to be our keyframe. Identifier is move box. 0%, it will transform, translate X to 0, and the background color will be at 50%. This should move to 200 pixels. This will become orange, and at 100 pixels, that's at 400, and this will be yellow. Look at how the box is moving and how the color is changing according to the way it's moving, and that is how keyframes look. I don't know, I find this very beautiful. So this is exactly like the weather application was working, although it's in reverse, dark, pale, and then like too pale. So this is basically how keyframes work, and this is how you add keyframes. So when you're adding keyframes, you can define your own styles, and inside that styles you can define a 0%, 50%, and you look at the transition, look at how the colors are blending in with each other, and it's not just appearing abruptly. That is why keyframes are used on such a high or huge basis. Moving on to our next question. Let me just stop that, or else my box will keep on moving forever. Okay. What are viewport meta tags and how do they affect web page scaling? Viewport, we have used it a lot. In every single HTML code that we wrote, you must have seen viewport every single where. Now the easiest example I can take of this is, this is the content of this particular page. Now if I directly go to mobile view, okay, don't take this. Where was we? Where? 46, I think. Yeah. Now if I go into Google search and search for something, say happy birthday. Now if I put it to the responsive design, if I don't do that, I put responsive, and then I have to reload this so that it will actually adjust to my screen size. And that change happens because we have defined the viewport. Or in technical terms, the viewport meta tag is an HTML element that controls the viewport's size and scaling behaviors on mobile devices. So when you suddenly change a website to its responsive design, it immediately doesn't change. You have to reload it, and then it checks the viewport size, and it checks how much it should be zoomed in, and then it adjusts the web page. So the web page adjusting itself according to the screen in which it's showing is basically how viewport works. Viewport is the one who decides how the size should be shifting or when the size should be what. Moving on to our next question. How do CSS preprocessors like SASS and LESS improve CSS development? The easiest way I can make you understand is that if you're using CSS, then you have to, if you're trying to cook a chapati, if you're trying to make chapati, if you're doing this with the help of just plain CSS, then you have to make the dough initially manually yourself. Then you need to roll the dough manually again by yourself. Then you cook the chapati, and finally you get the chapati. But if you're using SASS and LESS, it's like buying the chapati in the form of a packet. The dough has already been made, the rolling has already been done. All you need to do is just cook the chapati and get the final product. So you can see how much difference it is making and how much of a less time it will take for you to make the chapati using SASS and LESS. And basically that is how these works. These tools improve maintainability, reduce code duplication, and streamline the development process. SASS, or systematically awesome style sheets, and LESS, or leaner style sheets. They help your code to be more reusable. That is, you're using variables. All those styles that you're defining, you can put them and store them inside variables. So now, since they're stored inside the variables, you can keep on using them as many times as you want, or you can just keep on calling them as many times as you want to. So variables can be used to store values without repeating the same values across the style sheet. That is reusability. Next, you have maintainability, in which changes are easier to manage because they happen in one place. Now, because all these values you have kept inside one single variable, if you have to change it in the code, you don't have to go to every single particular element and change every single value. It's all stored in one particular location. So that is, if the value of x is 10 and throughout the code you have used x, then you only have to change it in one particular spot and all the values will be changed automatically. Next, the code, naturally, if the code is reusable and if it is maintained so well, the code will be a lot more cleaner. That is, styles can be better organized, especially with nesting the SASS and the LESS. Now let's move on to our next question. That is, how does the CSS calc function work and what are some of the practical use cases? Now, I think I need to show you the code first so that you can have a better understanding, and then we'll look at the definition. So this is question 21. Calc. Now, why would we need to use calc function? You must have created nav bars in your websites. So sometimes you want to make sure that a particular logo stays at the same position, or maybe when you're adding the contents like about us, home, and pages like these, when you're adding to the nav bar, you want to make sure that everything is spaced evenly and the logo maybe stays in a certain space, but it takes up as much space as it can. And sometimes doing it manually can become incredibly difficult. Trying to hard code it, ki, okay, logo should exist within this box, and then you add the home, about us, and all of these sections, and then it has a very high chance of becoming chaotic. That is where this calc function comes in handy, because calc is like you are giving the website, you're allowing the website to calculate the space. You only give the dimensions, and then based on that, the website has a liberty to calculate and adjust the contents according to the dimensions that you provided. Let me show you the code so that you can have a better understanding. Say we have a div, we have a parent container, inside of which we have a sidebar. Let me call this sidebar, and I'll have a paragraph here. Okay, that will be enough. And inside of this, okay, now outside of the sidebar, inside the container itself, I also need another section called as content. This is content area and the paragraph. I need 3 here. Okay. Now if I try to run the code, it's not adjusting anywhere. What is side base? It's sidebar. So this is taking its own sweet area, and this is also taking its own sweet area. Paragraph, they are by defined block. Paragraph elements are by defined block elements, so that's why they're doing this. But I don't want this to happen. I want them to exist side by side. But sidebar need to have a specific space, and content area needs to have a specific space. So let me show you how we can achieve that with calc. We need to add our style here. So let me just default out everything. Padding also 0. Now for container, I want to make sure the display is flex. That means it will automatically would have aligned itself. Next, we need the sidebar. Width, I need 200 pixels. Background color, I'm going to put crimson. Padding is 20 pixels. And then as for the content, I'll need some margin top, 20 pixels. Text should be aligned in the center. Background color will be pale violet red. Padding is 10 pixels. Now if I were to look at this particular code, let me remove that. Okay, now you can see how this is adjusted. However, if I try to minimize it, this is how it looks. It's not adjusting anywhere. But if I add the calc function here, for the content, if I add the width, calc 100% to 200 pixels. Okay, now if I try to do the responsive thing, you can see the difference yourself. Without it, it's filling the whole space. But if I add calc, it becomes responsive, and it only takes, it is taking up the space of 200 pixels, the 200 pixels I've given it, and it's subtracting from that 200 pixels and adjusting the content accordingly. That is how calc function works. It or in the form of a proper definition, the calc function of CSS is used to perform calculations direct within the property value. So we were calculating this directly inside the content, contents style, inside the content class, and we were not doing anything additionally. So the website, we gave the dimensions that it should be inside 200 pixels, and you can keep on subtracting it, but it should last for 200, but the width should be 200 pixels, and you can adjust the contents accordingly. That is basically how calc works. Moving on, how do pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements work in CSS? Give examples of each. Pseudo-classes are basically like telling your elements ki, okay, when this happens, do this. It's like when you hover your mouse over a particular element, then do something. So that is pseudo-class. So you must use hover a lot. Hover is used a lot. That's why I took the example of hover. And pseudo-elements are like when you want to add some styles to before the element came into existence or after the element, but you don't want to actually mess around with the actual elements. That is when you use pseudo-elements. Or in technical definition, pseudo-classes are a keyword added to a selector to specify a special state of the selected element. That is when the particular element is being hovered over, or if it's active, if it's focused. That is how pseudo-classes work. Pseudo-elements are keywords that lets you style a specific part of the selected element. That is before the element came or after the element came. Let me show you the code. So this is question 22. As for pseudo-class, if I have a button here called as hover, and then I put the styling of button, background color is initially pink, padding 10 pixel, 20 pixel, cursor pointer, and then if I add a pseudo class here, that is after hover, that is somebody is hovering over that particular mouse, then the background color becomes crimson or red and the color becomes white. Let's see how that came out. Now this is fine, but as long as I hover over it, the color is getting changed. That's how pseudo classes work. Now as for pseudo elements, if I come back to my code, say I have an h1 here, welcome, which should be above this. Okay, now if I add the h1, if I try adding styles to h1, position, relative font size, I'll keep it as 30 pixels, padding left 30 pixels. Now I want to make sure that before this h1 I will show something like some emoji, say a thumbs up, and the position of this emoji should not be relative, it should be absolute, and leave no space. So if I'll go back to the code, you can see how the thumbs up is coming after that, and I can do the same thing for after. There should be a thumbs up here as well then. Oh, the left is 0. There it is. That is how pseudo elements work in. Let me just close the port. And now let's move on to our next question. That is, explain the difference between transitions and animations in CSS. We already use transitions and animations in keyframe, but let's look at them, let's dig much more deeper into them. So transition defines how changes between two states should happen over a duration. The main difference between both of them that I observed is that transition always happens after a certain trigger happens. But for animation, the triggers are not required. Even without a trigger, it can happen. So animations define a custom sequence of styles that can change over time even without a trigger. So that is, if we were to look at the code for this, this is question 23. Well, transition is much more required when you need to make a smoother transition. So let me show you how. Say we are using the same thing we did before. We have a container. Inside of this, I'm having a button called as hover, and I want to make sure that when the hover happens, it's much more smoother, because in the last question when we were trying to learn about pseudo classes, you saw how abrupt it was. I want to make sure that it looks a bit more prettier and a bit more smoother. So let me add the width as 0 auto, text align center, padding top 50 pixels. And as for the button, let the background color as light blue. I don't want any border. Padding 10 pixel, 20 pixel. Font size, let's keep it as 20 pixels. Cursor should be pointer. Now let's add a transition. The background color should change. Transform with 0.3 seconds. And now, as soon as you hover over the button, background color becomes a deep sky blue, and the transform, I'll scale it to 1.7. So as soon as you hover over it, it should enlarge in a very smooth way. So if I hover over this, you can see how the colors are changing, but it's not very smooth. So it's happening because of a trigger. It's normal right now, but if I hover over it, because of the hovering, the color change, the transition is happening. So that is basically how transitions work. Based on some certain triggers, the element is affected. Now in case of animation though, let me add another. Animation is much more used when you have to say a particular, when you have to keep on doing a particular action in a loop or in a repeated time frames. That is where animation comes in. We're going to combine keyframes here. Again, we need a container. Inside of this, I'm just going to add, this is a bouncing text. Let's create a bouncing text. The class should be bounce. Now, I'll call it bouncing because the keyframes' name will be bounce. Let's create a keyframe first. Identifier will be bounce. So at 0% and at 100% should transform, translate 0. And at 50% when the bouncing is happening, transform, translate -20. Now as for the text, font size 25 pixels. Animation, I cannot see. Bounce 1 second and it needs to keep on doing infinitely. Color, let's add Rebecca purple. And for the container also we need certain styling. Width is 0, auto. Text align center. Let's give a little bit of padding top. Run this code. Oh. Okay, this was translate Y. The spelling. So you can see how the text is bouncing, and this is going on in a loop, and for that loop to happen we need that animation. So let me just close all of that, stop the port, and now let's move on to our next question, which is what is the clamp function in CSS? Now the clamp function is similar to what we did way back when we were adjusting the logo and the sidebars. The calc function. So the clamp function is also similar to the calc function. However, in case of clamp function, you actually set the minimum and the maximum width. Let me show you how. The definition first. Clamp is useful for responsive designs when you want dynamic scaling but within safer limits. That is, when you're using the clamp function, you have a minimum, preferred, and maximum limits. You specify the limits. So minimum is the smallest value that you can allow. Preferred is the ideal value. Maximum is the largest value that you can use. So let's look at the code. This is question 24. Clamp. Say we have a class here called as box. This will be adjusted with 200 pixels and 600 pixels. This will be jumping around with both of these. Now if I were to style the box, the width I'll call on to clamp. The smallest should be 200 pixel. Ideal is 50% of the page. Max is 600 pixels. Height I can specify as 100 pixels. Background color, I'll take crimson. Now if I run this and if I make this responsive, you can see how it's always taking the 50% of the page. but it's always alternating between 200 and 600 pixels. After 600 pixels it will not grow, and after 200 pixels it will not shrink, but it's always taking 50% of the page, and that is how clamp works. Okay, moving on to our next question. How are custom properties CSS variables created and used in style sheet? Now, you can create custom variables in CSS so that these variables you can use throughout the code, and you don't have to like specify it every single time, so that even if at one place it changes everywhere else in the code as well. So CSS custom properties are user defined variables declared using a / prefix and accessed with the var function. Let me show you how. This you must have seen a lot, and you must have used a lot too, or maybe some of you do know that it exists and don't really know how to use it. Let me show you how. So the most basic usage of this is when you have to like say define the colors of your web page. So say there's root. I'm going to call a primary color, which will be crimson in this example, and I need a secondary color which will be pink in this example. So now if I'm going to call onto the body and style it, I can just simply say var and the primary color, and the color of the elements I can just call var and the secondary color. So if I put elements here, hi, this should be pink and the whole page should be crimson. So you can now, even if I can create divs here, and inside of this particular div also I can specify the same color. So the biggest help with variables is that once you define it, you don't have to change it every single where. And if you change it once, that is, I want to change the color of all these divs at once, all I need to do is go to the primary color and change this to say blue, and the color changes. So that is, and every single div's color all changes as well, and that is the biggest help when it comes to using such user defined variables. Moving on to our next question. Provide examples of using units in CSS such as pixels, em, rem, percentage, and viewport width. So let's look at them one by one. Now before using all these units, let me just tell you one by one exactly of how these units work. So starting with pixels. Pixels is like fixed. So, and when an element's a size, you know it needs to be exact, that only it's like hard coding the size of elements. So with the borders, icons, or image dimensions, when you know that this will not change, then you can use pixels. Next you have M. M is responsive, and it's always based on the parent elements. So the font sizing or spacing that should scale with the parent elements, then you use M. Then next you have REM, or the root M. Now this is consistent font size or layout sizes that are scalable, but based on the root font size. So there should be a root font size that you're using, and based on that the REM works. Next you have percentage. Now percentage is again relative to the parent. We also saw in a lot of our codes ourselves that when we put 50%, the element was, or the container was only taking 50% of the website's width. So it's always based on the parent. So it's flexible widths, margins, or positioning based on the parent container. Lastly, you have VW, or the viewport width, which is again dynamically scaling based on the viewport's size. Let me just show you all of them with the help of a code. This is question number 26. Well, CSS unit. So we're gonna have 5 elements. A paragraph with this is going to be 50 pixels, and I'm gonna give the ID as A. There should be B, C, D. This will be not 50 rem, 5 rem, and this will be 5M. I think that will be too big, so let's put it as 2.5. This will be 50%. This will be 50 viewport width. Now I need to put this styling, then we can launch the website and see how it's coming out. So the paragraph, which is unique to everyone, the color should be white, and the padding should be 30 pixels. Now for element A, the font size should be 50 pixels. Background color should be Rebecca purple. For B, it is supposed to be 5 rem, Let's change the color a little, or maybe I'll just provide pink. For C, the font size is supposed to be 2.5 em. The background color, let's put deep sky blue. For D, it's 50%. 50% color, let's have pale violet red. And lastly, for E, we need the font size as 50 viewport width, and the background color, let's put green yellow. Alright, now let's see how it came out. So you can see 50 pixels how it's defined, 5 rem depending on the root, 2.5 em, and 50% is very small. And if we scroll down, this is 50. The width went out a little, but yeah, I guess you can see it now. So these are how, I think these CSS units are pretty self-explanatory. So let's move on to the next question, which is, what is the background repeat property and how do you control image repetition? Putting a background image is very crucial when it comes to CSS. So how the different background repeat properties existed within CSS, knowing about that is also very important. So the background repeat property in CSS specifies if and how an image in the background is repeated. So if we were to look at the example, this question you can only understand with the help of example. This is that important. So I already have an image here, W2. Make sure to get an image like this in this particular ratio according to your mobile's size. Alright, so let me just call in the styling elements here. So the background, okay, the body, and then the background, there is image. I'm gonna call the w2.jpg file, and the background size I'm going to define as 100 pixels, 100 pixels. Now again, I know the image size is not going to change. That's why I'm defining it with the help of pixels. So let's try with the first one, background repeat. There are a lot of them. Let's add repeat. Let's just put all of them and then I'll show you them one by one. No repeat is there. Repeat X is there. Repeat Y is there. Round. And space. Alright, so let's not like that. Okay, now let me just show you. Now you can see when I've repeated it, it's like repeating throughout the whole thing. But if I want to make sure that it doesn't repeat, I can just put no repeat and it will only appear one single time. Now if I want to make sure that it only repeats along the x-axis and not the y-axis, I can do repeat x. Similarly, if I want only the y-axis, and then if I want to make sure it's round. Now the round here comes in handy when you want to make sure that every image is coming but there is no gaps at all between the images, then you can use round, but that looks very bad. If you want a little bit of space between the images, then you can go for space. So that's how the background repeat property works. I hope that explanation was enough. Moving on to our next question, which is, explain how float works with examples of floated elements affecting the layout. Now we have already discussed about the performance optimization that using float is usually discouraged, but still if you're going for a CSS interview, you need to know about float. You must have seen newspapers' layout. Now look at how the text is just going around this image, and that is how float works. That is how elements work within the float. So all the content, it kind of like wraps around the image, or in a more technical definition, the float property specifies how an element should be placed within its container. So float has a lot of properties, float left, float right. Let me show you them one by one with our code. This is float. Say you have the content here. We need an image as well so that I can show you that clearly. The image source is w2.jpg. The height, and I'll specify the width, not the height. Width should be 100 pixels or maybe just 200, and okay, Next, let's have a box called as content, inside of which I'm going to have a paragraph. That seems enough. Okay, I'm going to have 2 paragraphs. Now I want to make sure that these kind of like wrap around that particular image. So let me show you how. Let's add the styling. So the image, it needs to float right, and it needs to have a margin right of 20 pixels. And as for the content, font size should be 15 pixels. Border 2 pixel solid. We also need to add a little bit of styling to the paragraph tags. Let's just add a border solid black. Now if you try to run the code, you can see how it is, the image is floating but the content is not exactly wrapping around. So let's just have overflow hidden. Alright, so here if I were to make this responsive, right now it's fine, but if I make this responsive, you can see how the content is kind of wrapping around that particular image, that giving that kind of newspaper thing that we were aiming for. That's how float works. You can even change this and change this to float left, where the image will come on the left side, or you can even have a float none, in which it will just align itself in the form of block elements. Now a problem with using float is that you can see how the parent element is kind of overflowing, and it's like the image is like literally levitating on top of these paragraph images. But if you don't want that to happen, so the most simplest way you can stop this from happening is putting overflow as hidden. So this way, staying in their particular spot. So even if I were to do it this way, it's not wrapping around the particular image and it stays within its defined box. So that's how you can stop the parent element from overflowing or from flowing all over their children. So moving on to our next question, which is CSS blend modes are used to define how an element's content should blend with the content behind it. You must have heard of styling the multiply and all that. That basically is how when you're adding an image, it should mix in with the background image just to have a bit more, it's just to make the website look a bit more prettier by making sure that every single element has the same theme. So you kind of like try to blend the child element with the parent element's themes so that it blends together and the child element doesn't highlight or doesn't just stand apart. So that's basically why you need the CSS blend modes. Moving on to our last question. What do you understand by the will change property in CSS? Now this is a very risky property, and this again backfires because this is not an ideal property. When it comes to performance, it's very likely that you will not use this because this affects the performance a lot. But the best part about this is it's kind of like a forewarning to your website, telling your website that this properties is this element's properties might change. So it's like announcing a warning. It's like giving a warning to the website. So let's take a metaphorical example. Say it's raining outside and you want to go somewhere. So naturally, if the weather is like, it looks like it might rain, you will either take your raincoat with you or your umbrella with you because it looks like it might rain. Now you're carrying this with you because it might rain. But there's a probability that it will not rain at all and you will not use it. You might not even need to use it. So that's how the will change property works. It's like a warning. So if it rains, then it's well and good you used your umbrella or your raincoat. But what if it didn't rain? Then you're just carrying your umbrella or you're just wearing your raincoat for absolutely no reason at all. So that again causes performance issues. So that is why the will change property is, it's good if you use it, but it's not mandatory and it's not very preferred to use it as well. So the CSS will change property is used to inform the browser which CSS properties of an element will likely change in the near future. If I were to look at the example, this is the will change example. Now if I have a container inside of which I have a button which again has hover, For the container, let's align it to the center. Text align should be center. Padding top, let's leave a bit of a space to the top. Next, for the button, let's have a padding of 15 pixels and 30 pixels. Font size should be 16 pixels. Background color, Rebecca purple. Color, naturally white. Okay, border looks very bad, so let's not have it. Cursor pointer. Let's add a transition. Transform, 0.3 seconds. Ease in and out. And we're telling the browser here that it might transform. And when will it transform? When we hover over the button, it will transform and it will scale to 1.2 of its original size. So if we try to run the code, we are already informing the browser that this will change, the size will change, and look at when we are hovering over it, how the size is changing. So that is how the will change property works. And that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching.